Hello. Over the past decade, Games Workshop has expanded its core range of games, often looking for ways to make miniature wargaming itself and the different worlds of Warhammer more accessible to new players. Releases like Warcry, Underworlds, and Kill Team have opened up their respective settings, adding new background, characterful new warbands, and innovative new ways to play. My guest today is Sam Pearson, formerly a member of the Warhammer Design Studio. Over the past 7 years, Sam worked on 40k and Age of Sigmar, developing Spearhead and Warcry, building, testing, and evolving rules for some of the most exciting games in the Warhammer worlds currently available. We talk about Sam's own gaming history, his career designing games for GW, and just a few secrets from behind the scenes at the Warhammer Design Studio. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with former Warhammer game designer, Sam Pearson. Sam, thank you so much for joining me. I like to start these conversations just by getting a little bit more of an understanding, I suppose, about your journey into the hobby. So when did you first get into gaming?
Yeah, pleasure to be here, by the way, Jordan. So I got into wargaming when I was very, very young, when I was in primary school. Actually predates Warhammer. So my first experience into miniatures were Airfix, 1/72nd scale. So World War II and Napoleonics. My dad sort of just thrust this hobby upon me. He would just buy me boxes of, US Commandos and things like that, Shermans, and I would spend my time building them. There wasn't any game associated to the Airfix miniatures, at least not back then. So my earliest games are actually games that I would design myself. But they were the worst war games imaginable, because they were war games that had been created by like a 9-year-old child who had never read or experienced another war game ever. So generally, what I remember, we had a 20-sided dice. I don't know where it came from, in the house. And what we would do is we would just write out 20 outcomes that would happen, and we would just roll the dice to see what outcome happened. And it'd be like, a US Marine dies, or like the Sherman fires a shot, or something like that. There wasn't any turn sequence or anything like that. We would just write out 20 things that could happen, and we just keep rolling the dice until we got bored. So that was the very, very first gaming that I did. And that meant that, so later on at primary school, I had a friend that came in with a White Dwarf magazine one day. And for me, I was already very familiar with the idea of what toy soldiers were, because I've been buying Airfix soldiers and painting them up. And so these were just the coolest toy soldiers that I had ever seen in my life. So almost straight away I was hooked. I borrowed the issue of White Dwarf, took it home with me, read it inside out. And then for the next Christmas, I got Warhammer 40,000 second edition. So that was the start into the hobby. So that would have been Christmas 1995. So going into 1996. And I started with second edition 40k, and then quickly went into Necromunda as well. So those were the two games that I grew up playing to begin with. And buying White Dwarf every month religiously as well, and living and breathing every single article in White Dwarf. And from there, I would say it never stopped, but there were definitely times when I would play Warhammer more or play it less, going to university, or I went on a gap year where I couldn't get to play Warhammer for a year and so on. But I sort of played Warhammer consistently from second edition 40k onwards.
Right. Do you remember any of those armies or gangs that you were playing a lot?
Oh yeah. I mean, my second edition 40k army was a shambles, because it was a young kids army. So I had the Praetorians. Do you remember the Praetorians?
Sure, yes.
I really liked the film Zulu when I was younger. So I had the box of Praetorians. I had an Imperial Guard army. I had the Imperial Guard Codex, and I had a Chimera. And back then you could buy supercharged engines for your Chimera, I think, for 25 points.
Right.
So I went into Lenton once, and this was when the Lenton site was very small. It hadn't been opened long. One of the cool things that you could do in Lenton, this was for a birthday, as I grew up not too far from Nottingham, you could order bits straight from the trolls you could order bits and it'll be there ready for you waiting. So I went and bought two Space Marine Dreadnought power packs, and I just super glued them either side of the back of my Chimera, and that was my Chimera supercharged engines. And I didn't call it a Chimera back then either. I called it a Chimera because who knows what the pronunciation is when you're 9, 10 years old. So that was my army, and it had a Blood Angels Death Company allied into it because you could have 25% of your points spent as and so it was an all around terrible army, but it was a Praetorians and Armored Fist squad with a Chimera and some Blood Angels, including a Death Company. That was my second edition army. So I didn't back then I didn't really play second edition properly. Necromunda was the first game where I could get really, really into it and understand all of the rules. Although Necromunda is more complicated in some ways because of its campaign system, it's a lot less complicated in other ways because you didn't have the big psychic phase, you didn't have to worry about vehicles and so on. And you didn't really need to worry about things like armor penetration and so on because it only happened when you like shot a bulkhead. So Necromunda was the big game that I played growing up. And so my first gang was the Ratskin Renegades. So I loved the Ratskin Renegades. And then I had a House Escher gang as well. So my House Escher. And it would mainly be playing it with my dad and one of my brothers. So my brother had Scavies and he had Redemptionists, and my dad had a Delat gang. And that's what would make up those early Necromunda campaigns of those 5 gangs fighting against each other.
Amazing. Yeah, and because it's interesting to look back on that period as well, because those games were very iconic. It feels like although obviously they'd been, 40k had already existed at that point. There's a lot in second edition 40k, and there's a lot in Necromunda that's still really relevant now that came from those games.
Yeah. I think second edition 40k is really when the background, the lore for 40k solidifies into what we know. So if you go back and look at Rogue Trader, it's all a bit weird and it's all a bit bizarre. And back then, Rogue Trader, it's not really a game as we know it. It doesn't have this out of the box experience. It's this big sprawling set of rules where you're supposed to have an umpire or a referee, and they will sort of pick and choose which rules they want. But once you get to second edition 40k, you have that sort of out of the box experience, the army lists, building an army, fighting against an opponent. And you also have sort of the core. I mean, you still have things like squats and stuff like that in the lore at that point. But you like what the Tyranids are, what Chaos is, what Eldar is, what the Space Marines are, the Primarchs, the Horus Heresy, all of those big beats exist there in second edition, don't they? And they're still true even today. And Necromunda as well just set the tone for so much of what does the Imperium look like outside of the big battlefields. So yeah, and it was really great to see Necromunda come back just a few years ago. So I've got my old school Necromunda miniatures, but I've also got a House Goliath gang made from the new Necromunda as well.
Amazing. Yeah, that's great. So you were designing games way back at the start of your hobby life, right? Were you still sort of designing stuff and playing like that kind of?
Well, yeah, so kind of. So those games they were very, very bad. I can't stress how bad they were. I think what would be interesting to say is so I never thought that I would become a games designer. When I was younger, it wasn't one of my aspirations, and wasn't to become a games designer for Games Workshop. Actually, I wanted to become an heavy metal painter. Is the job that I wanted. For me, just a few. So my first White Dwarf is 205, and then not long after that, you have things like the Green Knight, and so you have Mike McPhee's painting articles on how he did the Green Knight, and that for a young impressionable mind, he was like this god, this rock star of painting of the studio. So I kind of wanted to be like him when I was very younger. But what I've always loved about the Warhammer hobby is the act of creation. So back then, one thing I used to do was I used to make my own White Dwarf battle reports. So I would draw the battle maps inside MS Paint. We would write it all up in the style of White Dwarf. So we would have photos where we're posing for stuff. In fact, I've got one on my desk. My sister dug it out. So let me just hold it up to the screen so you guys can see. So here is a photo of me, sort of 10-year-old me, and this is the Chimera I was telling you about. It's all white, it's not been painted. But we would do poses, like silly poses, and we would with a disposable camera, and we would create our own White Dwarf battle reports, is what I used to do when I was very, very young. And then sort of as I got older into the hobby, that sort of creation around so not just playing the games, but also creating stuff. So I got very into the internet forums and posting sort of blogs on the internet forums and battle reports, much better produced at that point and so on. I started making sort of stuff like that. So then later on, when so before I worked at Games Workshop, one of the sort of the first big thing of design that I did was something called Hinterlands. And I did this, we're fast forwarding quite far now. This was after the launch of Age of Sigmar. So Age of Sigmar was launched in its first edition. And I thought that the 4-page rules for Age of Sigmar was a really, really cool thing that had been created. There were things that I didn't like I really hated the lack of a point system. I'm someone that loves a point system personally, so I really lamented that. But the fact that they managed to get the whole game and condense it down into 4 pages, Jervis Johnson did, thought that was just an incredible feat. And I wanted to try and do a similar thing with skirmish style gaming. So as I've just said, I grew up playing Necromunda was the first real big game that resonated with me. And so what Hinterlands it was me creating a set of skirmish rules for Age of Sigmar. And it was trying to condense it into as few pages as possible. So the first edition of Hinterlands was just 4 pages as well. But later on it expanded a little bit. I think it was about 8 pages by the end. But what that was is it was bringing that Necromunda Mordheim gameplay to Age of Sigmar. So I did all of the design for it, but much more than just doing the design for it, I made it look as professional as I could. So I did all of the graphic design for it. I did all of the miniature photography for it. I wrote background slugs. So there's a story at the start of it. There's even almost like a D&D style campaign that you can do at the end of it. Jordan, if it's useful, I can send over some images of Hinterlands that you could.
Oh, sure, yeah. If you got and that
Yeah.
photo as well, if that's.
Oh yeah. I'll send over some images of those.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So what Hinterlands tries. So what Hinterlands was for me was it was sort of me taking a stab at rules writing, but it was actually me trying to do the whole package. It was the same Sam that was doing the battle reports when I was 10 years old, but this time much better, and with Photoshop, so being able to do actual good graphic design. So that's what the idea for Hinterlands was to make something that looked as complete a package as possible. And luckily, the rules really, really resonated with the Age of Sigmar community back then. So in some ways, I was lucky because Age of Sigmar was very, very new and there wasn't any skirmish game mode for it at that time. So I was able to capitalize on that and provide a fun way to play skirmish gaming that anybody who played Necromunda or Mordheim would be very, very familiar with. It was every man moving around for himself on the battlefield, and it was about gaining experience and skills as you played your games, just like in something like Necromunda. But I was able to put those into a nice package, and that actually got my name out there. That got recognized by some of the designers in the studio. And from there, after I applied for a few jobs at Games Workshop. The first few jobs that I applied for, I didn't get. But then eventually a job came up in the studio, which I did get. So I managed to get a job as a rules writer for Games Workshop.
Fantastic. Because what had you been sort of doing in that interim period? Had you been studying?
Oh yeah, so I mean,
sort of led you to that,
lived like a whole life really. So so after finishing high school, I guess my A levels, I had a gap year where I worked for a charity in South Africa for a year.
Right.
Then I came back and went to university in Bristol, where I studied philosophy and sociology. So
Right.
something not related to games design in any way. Arguably not related to any profession whatsoever. I don't know what you do with a sociology degree, but it was what I was passionate about at the time. So after graduating from university, I got a job teaching in South Korea. So I moved out to South Korea. This is 2009-ish. And I lived out in South Korea for 5 years. And then I came back to the UK. I got married while I was out there. So me and my wife, we came back to the UK. And because I'd worked in education, I got a job in an education company in Bristol. So I was working there for a little bit. And one of the big things for me when I moved back from South Korea to England, which was 2014, is I was really, really, really looking forward to getting into Warhammer again. I've been playing Warhammer when I would come back for for holidays whilst I was out there. So I would come back, and my brother was living in Nottingham at the time, so we would spend the day at Warhammer World playing games and so on. But making the full move back, it was like, right, I'm really, really going to get into it again. I had this big Empire army planned. So I just bought my Empire army, started painting them up. There was this thing called the End Times going on at the moment. I wasn't paying any attention to it. Didn't need to worry about that. Then Altdorf gets destroyed. Oh no. And from there, I moved into playing Age of Sigmar at that point. And then it was from there really that I was so into the hobby, and I loved the creation side of it. I loved creating stuff that looked like a battle tome, or looked like a codex, or looked like a battle report. And then the next evolution of that was to create something that looked like a rule system.
Yeah.
And that was by far the thing that resonated with other people in the community more. There was quite a lot of people playing Hinterlands back in the day, and I still get messages about it now, which is really, really nice. That's what I was up to up until that point. Nothing really to games design.
Sure.
So luckily, I guess I just had a few good starting instincts for it to be able to put together a rule set, and for it not to be a complete disaster. Like a community of people that start playing it.
So then you went into the studio as a rules writer. So like, what's the sort of responsibilities of someone doing that job? Are you immediately writing entire rule sets, or are you tweaking specific rules, or what sort of things
well, I had 1 week before I started writing rules, so I had a week at least to sort of get settled in. Back then the team was very, very, very small. So the teams are much bigger now, and the teams are specialized for all of the games. So not only does 40k have its own team, and Age of Sigmar has its own team, also Kill Team has its own team, and Warcry and Underworlds has its own team as well. So all of the so the studio is much bigger now. Back then, for rules writers, I think so there was 6 of us in total, and we were writing the rules for every single game that the main studio put together. So not what specialist games were doing. They had their own team. So not Necromunda or Blood Bowl or Heresy or Middle Earth, but anything that was main 40k or main Age of Sigmar IP, we were doing all of the rules for it. So I can still remember when I first moved, my first week in the studio, what games were being worked on by everybody. So Jervis Johnson was just finishing off Blackstone Fortress. So he's on one computer doing that. Robin Cruddas was doing Kill Team Rogue Trader. Then sat next to me, Dave Sanders, he was doing actual Kill Team. So they were doing the actual Kill Team relaunch. So this was the 2018 relaunch. And they were doing, it was a little bit overdue. So they were doing the Rogue Trader as well at the same time. And then Cy Grant opposite me, he was doing Kill Team Heroes, I think it was called, the expansion. No, Kill Team Commanders, he was doing that. And then there was me, and then there was James Gallagher, who was doing some of the early Age of Sigmar 2 battle tomes. So I think he was doing Stormcast Eternals. And so I came in, and there was stuff for me to do almost straight away. So I was put to work, not on a battle tome or a codex straight away. I was put to work on the General's Handbook, so the monthly compendium for Age of Sigmar, yearly compendium for Age of Sigmar. I was tasked with coming up with a series of summoning systems for them. So we had, up until this point, the only summoning system in the game was Nurgle's summoning system that had been introduced. And so they wanted to do similar summoning systems for a range of different armies and things like Seraphon and so on, and release it inside that General's Handbook. So that was some of the first content that I did. Now that was under the tutelage of Jervis Johnson. So I would do some of my work, and then I would show it to him, as he was the custodian of Age of Sigmar at that point. So that was when I first joined the studio. And then it wasn't too long before I started writing full books as well. It would have been sort of a few weeks after doing those initial projects on the General's Handbook. I did a big sprawling campaign book for 40k. It's called Vigilus Defiant. It was the first big campaign book for 8th edition 40k. And I worked on that alongside Phil Kelly, who did all of the background. So that was amazing, by the way, getting to work with someone like Phil Kelly on a book like that, so new into the studio. And I did some battle tomes as well. So I did Beasts of Chaos was the first battle tome that I did. Then I did a Fire Slayers battle tome after that, and so on. So very quickly you start writing books. When I first moved into the studio at that point, there had already been the division between what a rules writer is and what a background writer is. And that division wasn't too old at that point. When you've had other designers on your show before, Jordan, a lot of them, they would say that their job was a games developer, and that used to be the old term. And the old term combined both background and rules. So, for example, Phil Kelly used to write both rules and background, and Robin Cross used to write both rules and background because they were games developers. But just coming towards the birth of Age of Sigmar and sort of the birth of 8th edition 40k, you then start to see a division. You start to see a specialization, I should say. Certain people are tasked with just writing rules, and certain people are tasked with just writing the background. And that's a system that's still in place today. So now when you work on a codex or a battle tome or any book really for one of the games, it's not usually one designer, it's two designers. It's a rules writer and a background writer. And so just say a book is around 180 pages, or that's probably a bit long, 120 pages. The background writer will be in charge of that first 60 pages where they talk about the background for the faction. And then the rules writer will be in charge of the second 60 pages where they talk about the and so on. But they work in tandem together. You work with the background writer as you're working on the project.
Yeah, because like I'm assuming there would be things, especially for like a new army, a new faction, where you're having to invent the nature of whatever that unit might be has to be created at the same time as the rules that represent it. So like, what's that interaction like? Is that literally sat around a table saying, okay, well, we could do it this way and it might work like this in game, and here's the explanation in the lore?
Yeah. So there's loads and loads and loads of back and forth between both the rules writers and the background writers, and also between miniatures sculptors and the background writers and the rules writers. So often what you see talked about is it almost gets presented as this conveyor belt where miniatures get sculpted, then they get shipped to the background writers who write some lore around them, and then it goes over to the rules writers who write the rules. But that's not really true. It's a lot more nuanced than that. There's lots and lots and lots of back and forth. Nowadays, when I was a games designer for Age of Sigmar, especially under Matt Rose, who is the current leader of the Age of Sigmar team, one of the earliest things you do when working on either a new range or just a new edition of a battle tome is that you need to look at all of the units within an army, and you need to think about what is the specialized role that this unit does in the army. What is its job that it does that nothing else can? How does it earn its place inside the army? And that's one of the earliest tasks that you do. And if you're struggling to find a role for a unit, then that's the perfect chance to go to the background writers and ask them how they see this unit operating on the battlefield. And also there's a little push and shove. You can think, well, it would be really neat if actually they worked this way, because that would really help us, give them a place on the battlefield. And the background writers will be perceptive of that, and they'll say, okay, I'll tweak the background for the unit a little bit and sort of bring up that idea a little bit more in its background so that it all harmonizes once you release the finished battle tome. It makes sense when you read about the unit on this page and then you see its rules on that page. They're telling you sort of the same story. So there's a lot of back and forth that happens between the rule writers and the background writers. And it's just inside the studio, just to give you an idea, everybody sat together. So there's sort of lines of desks, and there'll be a line of desk for the rules writers and a line of desk for the background writers. And you'll be talking you'll be talking to each other. And as you're talking to each other, all the other rules writers and background writers will chip in their opinions as well. So it's a big open discussion that's being happened most of the time. And then for any given codex or battle tome as well, there will be weekly meetings where just the people specifically working on that book, so not just the rules writer and the background writer, but the photographer, the artist, the graphic designer, the product developer, they will sit in a room together and they will talk about any issues that have arisen with any of those fields and all contribute ideas together. So really, really great place and lots of back and forth happening.
Sure, yeah. It sounds like a really interesting way to work. I mean, I imagine in the same way as there's like a page count, right? You've got 120 pages or whatever it might be to fill for a codex, and that needs to be split between the background and the rules.
Yeah.
I'm guessing there's something similar in like, okay, well, how many units are there going to, like physical units can we release that are going to be within the budget or within the project or what have you? So there's going to be this many miniatures. So like, are there other limitations of that nature when you're sort of putting together a faction? I'm guessing you can't just go, well, we'll do 1,000,000 because we really want to.
Yeah, 100%. There are definitely limitations on this. There's X number of machines at Lenton that can produce like X number of sprues at any one given time. So those are lots of considerations. Those, as a games designer, they're not really the considerations that you would ever have to worry about.
Right.
That's the thing that the miniatures designers and the miniature design managers are worried about. There's only a certain amount, even if capacity is increasing over time, there's only a certain amount of miniatures that can be made and a certain amount of new miniatures. Because even if you can hire so many designers to sculpt so many miniatures, having to make the tools to then produce those miniatures, that's a finite resource. So yeah, those are all considerations. But as a rules writer, usually you will know what units are going to be coming out, what releases are happening. Some little bits of leeway that you might have is you might be able to create, say, a new sub-build of a unit that then becomes its own war scroll, or you might be able to carve out a new special character. That was something that happened, especially in the early days of Age of Sigmar. There's the new Prince Vordry miniature, which is like the most beautiful miniature I've ever seen. It's incredible for the Soulblight Gravelords. But Prince Vordry started as just the old Vampire Lord and Zombie Dragon kit from Fantasy Battle, and saying, well, maybe if we say that this head is actually a special character. So, that's a decision that's coming out of the product developers and the rules writers and the background writers. They're thinking, actually, we can carve another niche and we can get a new special character into this army just by using the miniatures that are already available, just by choosing this head. And we think there's a fun archetype that we can add into the army doing this. Having a very martial vampire lord sounds like a really great archetype to add in. And it's different, say, to all of the Mortarks. So there is the bits of leeway like that that happened. Flesh Eater Courts is another example where you had things like the Crypt Flayers, which was taking the Crypt Horror bodies and the Vargeist wings and placing them together. So you had that 2-build kit from Fantasy Battle, then it became a 3-build kit going into Age of Sigmar. So there are little bits of leeway like that as well.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like it's almost at times like a problem-solving exercise, because all these different sort of limitations in different ways that then force you to go like, okay, well, how can we solve that problem in a creative way that adds some value?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, a common phrase that you'll hear inside the studio is like, what are you doing today? Somebody say, I'm just putting out fires, is what they're doing. And that means that there's certain problems that have arisen depending on what their field is, and they just need to find creative solutions for it. That is a lot of and it's a lot of what games design is as well. And whenever you're going into a new battle tome or a new codex, you're often presented with there are these problems with how this army currently plays. What are you going to do to fix them? And trying to come up with creative solutions each time. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
On a sort of day-to-day basis then as well, when you're writing new rules for whether it's summoning or a new war scroll or what have you, how is that structured in terms of, are you like, okay, I've designed a load of stuff in the morning and then in the afternoon I'm going to now play test it X number of times, or is it more fluid than that?
It's more fluid. It's down to the own designer. One thing I always admired about Jervis Johnson is he would start with the front page of the rules section is the first thing he would do, and then he would go on to the next page of the rule section, and then the next page, and he would just work on it in a linear fashion. Where I was much more like, oh, I'm inspired by this, let me go and do this quickly. I'm inspired by that, let me go and do that quickly. Now, in terms of what you do have fixed, though, is you have fixed deadlines on when you need to have a first draft finished. And you need to have, because that needs to be sent out to the playtesters, and it needs to start getting playtested internally as well. So you need to make sure that no matter what, you're flexible on your day to day, but there are some deadlines that are always looming over your head. Like you need to have a first draft finished by this date, and that's something that you cannot miss. We would have inside the studio, we would have a whole day set aside for playtesting each week. And when I worked in the studios, it was Thursdays. Thursdays would be away from computer, and you would be playtesting, and it wouldn't just be your own things. You would be playtesting everything else that everybody else is working on. So we would come up with a schedule for the day, how it's going to operate. But there were also, especially by the end, there are lots of playtest groups that are volunteers from the wider community, and that get to see some of the first drafts of the rules early and contribute feedback on them. So it's important to get that first draft done as quickly as possible, because as soon as you do that, you can start to get feedback both from the other rules writers, but also from the playtest network.
Sure. I imagine it's very tough to sort of read to work through feedback. So if you're making an entire army, are you playtesting that entire army in one go and then trying to sort of pass the feedback and go, oh, okay, maybe this stat is too high, or maybe this system is a bit too over tuned? Or how do you break it down? Does that make sense? Because it's such a big thing, and there's so many moving parts in those rules. How do you work out if it's one specific thing that's broken?
Yeah, so first things, you need to have really thick skin working as a games designer, because you need to be told that your designs are terrible or they're broken, or all sorts of lists on a daily basis, and you need to just smile and be like, okay, yeah, thanks for the feedback. Let's to the bottom of this then, and those bits of feedback will be the most useful. In terms of so the playtesting really sort of evolved whilst I was working at Games Workshop. When I first joined the studio, playtesting was in its early days, really, and back then it was much more anecdotally led. It was, this playtester thinks this combination is a bit too strong, or we played this combination and that seemed a bit problematic, and we think it was this unit. Over time, and especially when Matt Rose joined the team, it became much more data driven. So now we have there's an app that the playtesters interact with, sort of an internal app, and they log all of their games, and we get to get data from their games, and we can see things that are getting played, but also things that aren't getting played. We can calculate win rates from it, and all sorts of things like this. So there's lots and lots of big data now that we can dig into to try and get those answers. But I would say there's definitely an art to working out what the crux of an issue is. The one thing that's taught in games design, and I don't 100% agree with it, but one thing that's taught often in games design is if somebody gives you a suggestion on how to improve a game, what they're actually doing is telling you what a problem is, and what you should do is try and identify what the problem is, and then probably come up with your own solution to that problem. I think often player suggestions can be very good. Actually, it's just the small part that I disagree with. But in general, it's a good observation that listening to player feedback tells you two things. It tells you, one, a solution that they have for a problem, but also tells you what that problem is in the first place. And what you need to do is sort of peek past that solution, try and identify what the core of the problem is, and then see, is their solution the correct way, or are there other solutions that we could go for? And yeah, it's definitely a balancing act, with a bit of art to it, I would say.
Sure. Yeah, I can imagine. You mentioned before that obviously you were working with Phil Kelly, you were working with Jervis Johnson. I mean, that must have been pretty cool to be working with people whose games you had been playing a number of years before. Now you're literally like sharing ideas and collaborating.
Yes, yeah. I can remember. So my interview for the job that I landed at Games Workshop. Midway through that interview, Jervis Johnson and a number of other rules writers came into the room to ask me some questions. And that was, I got a little bit starstruck seeing Jervis come in. He's really tall as well, so he just comes in towering in. Which I don't think, you might not know that Jervis Johnson is really tall if you've ever seen him. He's really tall. I'm 6 foot, and he made me feel short. And yeah, it was really, really, really great working with, especially Jervis for me. Jervis Johnson was, I don't think I would be half the games designer I was if I didn't get the chance to work alongside Jervis Johnson, because for me, what he instilled in me was discipline as a rules writer and a really, really good set of fundamentals. So I almost got a job at Forge World before I got a job in the main studio. And I think there's an alternate dimension out there where, like, I don't work with Jervis in the same way, and I'm a much more sloppy rules writer. So I really, really value the experience that I got to have with him. One thing, so I never told Jervis this, but I had a preconceived notion going before I worked with him that turned out to be completely false. I don't know why I thought this, but I thought that Jervis Johnson might be stuck in his ways. I thought that he might be, I've designed so many games like in the past, and I know the right way to do it, and so on. But that couldn't be further from the truth. If anything, I was more stuck in my ways when we were working together. I was more, oh, this is how we used to do it in Warhammer. We should still do it this way. Jervis was forever, when I worked with him, forever bringing in new board games, new games, things like that into the office, doing a live unboxing. We would go through the rules together, go through the systems, see what things were cool, what things worked, what things didn't work. He was always looking at how to push the envelope, how to develop his craft further, how to make, we're working on Age of Sigmar together for a long time, how to make Age of Sigmar better than it was before. So it was really, really inspiring to work with him. And I had this preconceived notion that I just shouldn't have had. I don't know why I had it. Just 10-year-old me had somehow picked up this from reading White Dwarfs, and it just turned out not to be true whatsoever.
Yeah, I wonder if some of that could possibly be, this is a figure, as much as he's a real person, also
Yeah,
this like figure from the history of these games, right? And
yeah,
it's
yeah,
part of the fabric of Games Workshop and Warhammer history. So
yeah,
perhaps that's a factor there. That's really interesting though about like bringing in external stuff, because I'm always quite fascinated about this. And obviously, as Warhammer has evolved and the design studios continue to bring in new generations, we've gone from, in the early days, Warhammer didn't exist. So the designers and the developers,
mhm,
they were playing all of this other stuff.
yeah,
Now we're at a point in time where Warhammer's existed for 40 years and new generations of designers are coming in, and most of their history may be in playing Warhammer. So you kind
mhm.
of have this really interesting transition, it seems like, from the outside. I mean, were you encouraged to bring in lots of different stuff? Can you look to the past and look outside GW for inspiration?
Oh, yes, definitely. So it is true that modern designers now grew up playing Warhammer,
Hmm.
and Warhammer's been around for so long. Even
Sure.
even the senior managers now grew up playing Realm of Chaos and stuff like that. So there's there are a lot of people in the studio that grew up playing Warhammer. But I think the one thing that might be that people might not have thought of, but so I'll just say it. But really, like Lenton, Nottingham. So the Games Workshop building right there. That is probably the biggest concentration of tabletop geeks in the world. And so every game under the sun is getting played inside, Games Workshop, or has fans inside Games Workshop. So I'm a big fan of role-playing games. I'm a big fan of card games. And I had lunch breaks where I would go to a cafe across the road, to play Magic the Gathering on our Friday lunch breaks, and that would have me as a rules writer, would have some background writers, have photographers, have artists. There was an heavy metal painter too. So there's a whole group of us all playing Magic, that's just one example. But the I was getting my computer fixed once, and I had to go over to the IT team, and everybody was just talking about Trench Crusade in the IT room all of a sudden. Everyone was really, really excited by Trench Crusade. So we had a little chat about Trench Crusade and how cool it looked. So everybody's aware of all of these different games, and there are fans of them. People are playing them. For Jervis Johnson, his big hobby was board games. So he would always be talking about some new board games, some new mechanics. All of the studio got addicted to Heat. I don't know if you know Heat. It's a racing.
Right.
It's an early Formula One style game by Days of Wonder. It's got some really, really great mechanics because as you go round corners, each corner has a gear stick value, which is how many cards you can play, or something like that. And so you're trying to navigate the corners without spinning out is really, really hard to do. And sometimes if you haven't kept your cards well in your hand, then you have to play cards that will spin you out because it goes above the gear stick level. So yeah, almost like a speed limit is the way it works. So yeah, we were always looking at mechanics like that, different mechanics wherever we could. For me, I was really inspired by video games. I grew up playing video games too. So on my own YouTube channel, I have a video talking about Spearhead, and I talk about the idea of negative feedback loops in Spearhead. And a negative feedback loop, just quickly, is sort of like the opposite of a death spiral or a wind spiral. Both death spirals and wind spirals are positive feedback loops. It's where something happens in the game and that exacerbates over time. It sort of loops around. That's a positive feedback loop. A negative feedback loop is where something happens in a game and then the opposite happens. So somebody is winning and then it rewards the loser, or the loser and so on. And the example that everybody gives of negative feedback loops is Mario Kart. Mario Kart is a game where the worse you do, the better the power-ups you have. And so that works as it keeps the game more casual. It's why you can play against your nephew or niece who's much younger than you, because they're going to get the mushroom or the star or something, or the blue shell, something really powerful to keep them in the game. So everybody is taking inspiration from all sorts of places. So other miniature war games, other card games, role-playing games, video games. The important thing is not to just ever take mechanics wholesale. You need to pick and choose bits here and there. You need to give it a Warhammer spin. So Warhammer games are usually about brutal combat. So you need to make sure that the game has some sort of element of brutal combat in it. But there's lots of great inspiration out there, and we were definitely encouraged to play as many games as possible. And I think things like Warhammer, the modern skirmish games evolving from I go, you go to now using the alternating activations. That probably wouldn't have ever have happened if we were all just playing, the older Warhammer games. Even Gorka Morka and Old Necromunda ran on I go, you go rather than just alternating between the fighters. So I think you can see some of the influence there impacting the games.
It must be really interesting as a designer and living and breathing game design. Like when you do go and play a video game, or you go and play a board game or a card game, like are you seeing, is it like seeing the Matrix? Like you can see the code behind the actual game itself?
Yeah, I think so. You do, so I went into games design without any formal training or experience. So I must have just had some, just from playing some games, had some okay instincts with it and managed to get myself a job. But then once I started being a games designer, I took learning games design as a craft very seriously. So started to read books on the subject, started to watch a lot of YouTube video essays on the subject, started to me and Jervis, we spent a lot of time working on things like the standard wording inside Age of Sigmar, and you get into really, really lengthy conversations about, for example, agency inside a game. Should it say that the player does the action, or should it say that the unit does the action? And does a unit move across the battlefield, or does a player pick a unit to move across the battlefield? These sorts of things, and they don't sound that important maybe to a layman at first, but you get really, really into it because you start to get to really, really weird edge cases, no matter which way you go. So on that example, just say you say, oh, it's really thematic if the unit does the thing. So the unit moves, the unit shoots, the unit fights. Then you end up with rules saying like this unit can re-roll a 1 to hit. Is the unit actually re-rolling the dice? That seems a bit strange, isn't it? The player that's rolling the dice. And so where do we draw that back and find a balance? So you get really, really into it. And yes, pick up all sorts of games and read through the rule books and what is this? Throw it behind me. An example is so my dad loves Ticket to Ride, so I play a lot of Ticket to Ride. The rule on who goes first in Ticket to Ride, I don't know if you've played Ticket to Ride, but the rule on who goes first is the player who is the most well-traveled is the and so the game starts off with this incredibly subjective. And if you try to follow it to a T, if you wanted to apply the rules as written and the rules as intended debate here, you can get into all sorts of arguments about what constitutes as well-traveled. Is it the number of countries, the number of continents, time spent abroad, time spent on trains? I don't know. So you do start to see these sorts of rules in other games where you're like, well, we definitely wouldn't be able to write it like that in Warhammer. We definitely couldn't say like the player who is the most well-traveled gets to take the first turn in 40k.
Sure. So you and Jervis sort of were leading the development of Age of Sigmar through a really interesting period in Age of Sigmar's life, right? Because you were picking up from it existed, and then you moved into helping to improve it and establish it, right?
Yeah. So when I first joined the studio, like I said, there were 6 of us, and we all worked on everything. And that was just when 8th edition 40k was only sort of 3 or 4 months old at that point. So that was just when the output of the studio had ramped up considerably. So 8th edition 40k was the first edition of 40k where every single codex came out in the edition. Well, I guess 2nd edition also had that, but in between 2nd edition and 8th edition, usually, I think it was Tau players had to wait multiple editions of the game to get an update of their codex. But no, it was every codex coming out, and this was a time when there were way more factions than there were at any other point in the game. You had, Admech, Gene Stealer cults, Custodes. You had so many Imperial Knights, so many new factions in the game. So it meant that there were so many more books getting produced by the Book and Box Game Studio. So very quickly it was decided that, well, actually the studio needs to expand to be able to keep up with this, and it probably needs to specialize. In the first sort of 6-7 months that I was working in the studio, I did 40k books, I did Age of Sigmar books, I did Kill Team. All of these, as a rules writer, they all have their own different rules language. Even 40k and Age of Sigmar, you might think that in many ways they operate the same. Sometimes it's little things, like in Age of Sigmar you say pick a unit, whereas in 40k you say select a unit. And these add up over time, and having to switch your brain constantly into different writing modes was quite hard. So it was decided that the rules writers really should specialize, and the background writers should specialize too. It's just as hard for the background writers, where one day they're writing about goblins in Moon Clan, and the next day they need to read up on what the Necrons have been up to because they haven't touched base with the Necrons for a little while, and then begin writing a Necron codex. So we all specialized, and I was given the choice. Although I don't think if I had chosen, like they gave me a choice, like, which team do you want to join, the 40k team or the Age of Sigmar team? I chose the Age of Sigmar team because I wanted to work alongside Jervis. But I think if I'd chosen the 40k team, I'm not sure they would have let me, maybe. I think the choice had already been decided. It was already expected, is what I should say, that I would go to work in the Age of Sigmar team. And so me and Jervis were the first 2 members in that, but it wasn't like that for long. Very quickly we had other rules writers join, so we had Lewis join us very quickly after that, and then the team started expanding from there. So moving into the Age of Sigmar team, so I got to work with Jervis. The other thing was I got to have custodianship of Warcry. So that was quite nice. Didn't want to just have 1 game, got to have 2 games. So Jervis was the custodian of Age of Sigmar, and what he did is he divided the 3 ways to play: open play, narrative play, and match play among different designers as well. So I took on narrative play inside Age of Sigmar. And then I also took on full custodianship of Warcry. So the entirety of 1st edition of Warcry I wrote, starting from the core book, and wrote everything in it up until 2nd edition, where I wrote the core book as well, and then passed it on to its own team. So it was a really, really fun period to start working in. It was when Age of Sigmar had gone into its 2nd edition, but it was still early days, really. Things like the Age of Sigmar was really the first keyword rule system that Games Workshop had used. And so it was just sort of like stamping down how the keyword rule systems work, and us formulating the standard wordings. That was the big thing that we did alongside Jervis Johnson, was we were started to template the rules. I think up until that point, you just sort of had to almost pick up how the rules were written via osmosis. But what Jervis Johnson sort of spearheaded at that point was, no, let's have a very concrete database with examples and lots of rules about how the rules should be written. And we will follow these rules as closely as we can to try and minimize FAQs and erratas to the rules. So that was really starting to pick up. So that was a really, really big part of it. Was we'd have a meeting every week with all of the rules designers and the editors, and we would all sit together with all of the wordings and try and choose which is the best wording so that it can live in the standard wording, and all of the second edition codexes, battle tomes, will follow those wordings. How can we improve wordings? What wordings have triggered FAQs and erratas? How can we make them better? And so it was this evolving document over the course of second edition that really, really helped make Age of Sigmar. I think that from a rules point of view, it's a very robust system. Really, really helped with that, and it was really, really fun to work on. And when I said earlier on about Jervis really instilling in me good discipline and good fundamentals, I think a lot of it came from things like us working on the standard wordings together. So one of the things Jervis would always say in that meeting was, the shorter rule is the better rule. Like, let's try and make the rule as concise and elegant as possible. And so when I'm writing rules still to this day, in Jervis's deep baritone voice, I still have the shorter rule is the better rule sort of resonating behind me. Oh, okay, maybe I can just write this a little bit shorter, not so long.
Yeah, that's dead interesting, because it often, like with the proliferation of like armies books, codexes, and battle tomes, as well as supplements and editions and stuff like that, it feels like, just from the outside, it must be very tough to keep track of like all the rules references. Right. I mean, as a player, you can sometimes be going through multiple books. As a designer, I imagine that's even more difficult when you're like, have we done that rule before? Did we phrase it slightly differently?
Yeah,
So hearing that
yeah,
there's almost a Bible being created
yeah.
is really interesting.
Well, so that actually evolved over time. So Jervis Johnson laid down the foundations for the standard wordings, and that put together a database for it. But it was very much during the peer review process. You would have to, I would look through the other designers' books, and they would look through my books and do the same. And we would highlight stuff and say, I don't think this is the standard wording. The standard wording is as follows. And the editors would do it as well. And so there was a lot of that, but we almost had to catch it by eye. The interesting thing now with Matt Rose as the lead for Age of Sigmar is, because he has a background in the video games industry, the AAA video games industry, and also because he's got really great scripting skills, he's able to build apps and so on, is what you do now is once you've written a first draft of a battle tome, you upload it into this purpose-built app that we have, and it will cross-reference every single rule in that book against this database. And that database has its early foundings in the work of Jervis Johnson. It's been built upon over the years. And now, rather than us having to apply it by hand, essentially, straight away you get an error report that comes up and will tell you how many, which rules deviate from the standard wordings and what the suggested wordings are for them, so that we can go back in and fix it. So stuff like that has really, really revolutionized Games Workshop. So my career at Games Workshop is just over 7 years. So you can see sort of the span from when I first started, the company had only been taking its first tentative steps into FAQs and erratas happening at a regular rate. And so very quickly it was like, oh, if we want to keep these, keep the amount of FAQs and erratas under control, we need to apply standard wordings so that we're not writing rules in 10 different ways. And so that was the early work from Jervis Johnson. And then as it's built up, it's become more professional now. And we have scripts that will tell us when a rule is deviating from the database, so that we can amend it.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and that makes so much sense, right? Because at the end of the day, it's specific language that should be the same every time.
Yeah. We like to think of the rules writing like a computer code. And so what you don't want is you don't want a rule to blue screen your game essentially, and all your miniatures glitch through the battlefield and fall to the floor. What we want is for the human brain is the computer of the of tabletop games, but we want them to be able to compile those rules and for it to make sense. And that's where that standard wording really helps with that. And it doesn't matter if you're doing there are debates in rules writing on how much jargon you should use or how much natural English that you should use. And I always err towards the natural English side. I always try and explain rules with simple terms rather than coming up with a jargon for it, if possible. But at the same time, no matter which approach you choose, the most important thing is being consistent and not trying to explain the same mechanic in multiple different ways.
Sure, yeah. I think ambiguous wording and dangling modifiers and all that sort of stuff has ever been
Yeah,
the challenge of interpreting as well as writing rules, it seems.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Incredible. I mean, you mentioned Warcry that you'd taken on and you were the custodian for. I mean, how
Mm,
did that project come about? Is that someone somewhere says, right, we want to do a skirmish game set in this universe, but we
mm.
don't know anything about it. Go away and invent it. Or
Yeah,
is there
sure.
like a bigger brief that's like, okay, it's going to be about the chaos like cults in the 8 points, and they're going to be doing this, and we need it to work in this way. Like how does a game like that start? I suppose.
Yeah, so different games have different origin points. So when we talk about the main Warhammer studio, really there's two studios. There's the miniature studio, and then it's not got a very fancy name. It's called Book and Box Games, and that's the studio where all of the rules writers, the background writers, photographers, and so on sit. And really, a game comes from one of those 2 points. So, for example, Kill Team. Kill Team is a game, especially the sort of the 2018 relaunch of Kill Team. Kill Team comes from the rules writers and the product developers and that side of the studio, the Book and Box Game Studio, first and foremost. If you remember to the relaunch of that game, it had the Skitarii versus the Genestealer cults in the box. And so there weren't any new miniatures. It wasn't a game being launched around new miniatures. It was about, let's take the existing collection and create a new game mode for it. So that was the start of Kill Team, and there are lots of games that come from that sort of point. Spearhead is another one that came from Book and Box Game Studio. Other games arise from miniatures first, and Warcry was an example of that. So Warcry was really so you move into Age of Sigmar, and you move into this idea of there being all of these different magical realms. The miniatures designers wanted to explore what do the people from each of these realms look like? Or specifically, if chaos has infected all of the realms, what does a chaos warband look like from each of these? And so the early concept of the game came from miniatures. They put together a warband for each of the different realms, and even one for the 8 points as well. So there was the Spire Tyrants that weren't associated with any one realm, but sort of Archaon's point in the middle. And they imagined a skirmish game for them. But I think what's interesting is they imagined a skirmish game that would be gladiatorial combat. It's just sort of the rough idea that they had in their head. So you can see that with a lot of the weapons of the early Warcry warbands. They've got nets and harpoons and gladiatorial style helmets and so on. There's sort of a gladiatorial vibe to the early Warcry miniatures. So that's what they sort of imagined. Now, from that initial scope, it then got expanded upon when the other side of the studio, Book and Box Games, started to work on it. So Kill Team had come out the year before. Kill Team was wildly successful. Kill Team was a great gateway into Warhammer 40,000, and Kill Team used all of the factions of Warhammer 40,000. So the idea was, let's make Warcry the equivalent to this. Let's have Warcry be the same gateway into Age of Sigmar. Yes, it's coming with these new fantastic miniatures, but let's introduce all of the factions into the game and allow anybody to start a warband and eventually turn it into an army. Now, a decision like that's not something that a rules writer makes. That's sort of like a few steps before the rules writers actually begin working on it. So that was the scope decided by, say, the managers and the product developers and so on within the studio. By the time rules start to work on it, the scope is solidified into what the final game became. So it's a game set in the 8 points rather than in any gladiatorial pits or something, set in the wider 8 points. And it's going to be a skirmish game that focuses on these Chaos Warbands as a center point, but also allows any of the other Age of Sigmar factions to take part as well. Working on Warcry, so with Warcry, I really wanted to do it because, as I said before, the first game that resonated with me was Necromunda, and I grew up playing, Necromunda, Gorka Morka, Inquisitor, Mordheim. Like, all of these games really, really spoke to me. I love narrative gaming, and I did Hinterlands before I joined the studio, which again was a narrative set of narrative skirmish rules. So I really, really wanted to do it, but I was quite new in the studio at the time. I was only been working there for about 6 months when we started on that. So in the studio, if somebody's passionate about something, they're very, very good at being like, this person loves match play. Let's make sure that they get to write some match play content. Or this person loves orcs. Let's see if we can get them to write the orcs. Or this person loves narrative skirmish games. Let's see if we can do that. At the same time, I was quite a new designer. So before the core chunk of design work starts on a game, there is something before called the research and development, or the R&D. And that was done by Jervis Johnson. So Jervis Johnson, he did all of the R&D for Warcry. And then when it came to actually writing the finished product, writing the core book onwards, that's where I stepped in. So the goal of R&D is always to put together a prototype. You put together a prototype of a game, or multiple prototypes sometimes, and you present the multiple prototypes to all of the stakeholders, say the management, the product developers, and so on, and you get sign-off on elements of the prototype or wholesale. So Jervis put together the prototype for Warcry, and once we got sign-off on what that was going to be, then I started to work on the final product. I do actually have a video on Warcry on my own channel where I go into this in a bit more, but I think it's fun to talk about it here as well. So Jervis's prototype had some elements that made it through to the final game and some elements that didn't. So the first thing is Jervis deserves all the credit for Warcry's really cool initiative system. So Warcry has this great initiative system at the start where you roll 6 dice, and whoever rolls the most singles, so no matching dice, gets to choose who goes first. And then all of your matching dice, you sort them into doubles, triples, and quads, and those are used to do special powerful abilities. And this is almost you can see this from what I said about Jervis always bringing in board games and other games and so on to look through their mechanics. There isn't any one board game that has that initiative system, but there are lots of games that have fun dice mechanics to them. And so it's its own unique riff on those sorts of some fun dice mechanics that he was seeing in various other board games that he liked. So he came up with that in the prototype. Other things in the prototype, it used the small board, the small battlefield, which was an idea that came from Kill Team. He used the cards to develop the scenario, and that was an idea that came from the open war cards from 8th edition 40k. So those were the elements that made it through to the final game. So some real core foundations of Warcry. Some of the things that didn't make it through, the initial prototype ran on the Blackstone Fortress dice, or the dice from Curse City. So it had the D6s, the D8s, and the D12s. And what would happen is when two fighters fought against each other, they had a weapon skill, and you would compare the weapon skills. And if the attacker's weapon skill was higher, they would get to roll the D12s. If it was lower, they would roll the D6s. And if it was equal, they would roll the D8s. And these weren't normal D12s, D6s, D8s. They were the Blackstone Fortress ones. So they would either have blank faces that were a hit, or faces that were a critical hit. So that was the initial combat system. But one of the desires, and that was a cool system, I thought it was pretty neat. But one of the desires after the prototype was, no, actually, we need a game that runs just solely on D6s. And that was a production issue. That was wanting to keep sure that the costs of the game were as good as possible. So we needed a system that ran on D6s. So that was an element of the prototype that didn't make it through. And one thing that I was tasked to do was to try and take the essence of that combat phase and distill it into a system that worked on D6s. So I kept the idea of hits and critical hits, but the critical hits were on a 6. And instead of comparing weapon skills, you compared strength toughness to decide if you need a 3 or 4 or a 5 to score a normal hit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting, especially given where, like, okay, this is going to be a gateway game
Mm.
as a sort of part of the brief. Because I guess there must be a real tension there around, well, we can come up with something really cool, like the initiative system, for example. Like you say,
Mm.
it's really, really interesting. It's very fun. It's very unique within like Games Workshop games, but it's also very different to how you then would play Age of Sigmar, right? So you're
Yeah, that's right. So over time, the thinking has moved away from those being gateway games.
okay,
And so now the gateway games are Combat Patrol and Spearhead,
of
where
course.
the idea is these are game modes for the big flagship games.
Hmm,
And actually there's a big enough audience for those types of skirmish games that Kill Team and Warcry thrive when they're left to do the best skirmish games possible.
right.
So you can see that with 40K really, where the relaunch of Kill Team in 2018 is sort of based on the 40K rules at that point. But then when it comes around to the next edition of Kill Team, which is very similar to the current edition, it gets a whole revamp and it gets a bespoke rules treatment.
Hmm,
Now it has very, very, very different mechanics to big 40K. And at the same time, you have Combat Patrol, which is your gateway now into playing big 40K. So the thinking inside the studio evolves over time, and this is an example of it. At
hmm,
one point, Kill Team and Warcry were thought of as being gateway games to the larger games. Now they're thought of as being ecosystems in their own right, hobbies that people can get into, and a hobby where instead of collecting one army, you collect multiple Kill Team factions, for example.
sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because I suppose it's a similar kind of structure as the specialist games, right? They are their own ecosystems. They have their own
Yeah,
fans and their
exactly,
own ranges.
exactly.
And yeah, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, yeah. So specialist games, they have Horus Heresy now, which is much more akin to one of the
Hmm,
big flagship games, and then they have their other smaller IPs like Necromunda and so on.
sure. Yeah. So, since leaving Games Workshop, Sam, you've gone on to create your own YouTube channel. You mentioned a couple of the videos that you've done where you're sort of delving into the actual, almost the behind the scenes making of the games that you've worked on and really getting into the cool history there. I mean,
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
what's the long term plan there? What's the sort of vision for the channel?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I've started the YouTube channel because I thought it'd be fun. This almost speaks to what I said before about just liking to create stuff. So the idea of creating a YouTube channel, as much as I'm grappling with how to get good audio, as much as I'm grappling with that, I am having fun doing it. What I would love for my YouTube channel is for it to be a great games design resource. And so I'm trying to do a variety of videos. It's only about a month old now, the channel. So I'm doing some videos where I dissect my own designs. So I've done one where I dissect Spearhead and one where I dissect Warcry. I do some that delve into the history of games. So I do one that delves into both Inquisitor, but also this older game that Inquisitor is based upon called the Western Gunfight Wargame Rules, which is a really, really interesting game because I wouldn't have known about it unless Jervis Johnson told me about it. But it is so influential both on Necromunda and Inquisitor, but also arguably on Dungeons and Dragons. It's a very, very influential game. So I do a video on that. And then I've also done a video where we compare I Go, You Go and alternate activation. And that's sort of more of a design theory game. So with that one, I don't just focus on Games Workshop as well. I branch out and I look at how does Bolt Action do it? How does Star Wars Legion do it? And how do a variety of other games do it as well? And so those are sort of three different styles of videos really that I'm working on. And I'm just having fun sort of rotating through them at the moment. So we'll see how that goes. It's been a fun experiment so far. I've been enjoying it, lots to learn. It's such a multifaceted job, isn't it, Jordan?
Sure,
Making
like YouTube as a thing.
yeah.
Yes, it
Yeah,
is.
having to learn about lighting, having to learn about audio, having to learn about thumbnail graphic design, and then
Mm.
just script writing, recording, presenting, so on. There's lots to learn. So luckily, people have been very, very patient with me so far, and have been very supportive. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. But the goal for me actually isn't to become a YouTuber full time. What I want to become is a freelance games designer. So I am talking with some other companies as well at the moment behind the scenes, which is exciting. I'm also working on a few of my own designs. I've got some games that I would love to make. So eventually I'll start showcasing them on the channel as well. So that'll be fun for the future. But yeah, at the moment, I'm just sort of plowing away, trying to get a few YouTube videos under my belt, and then we'll see what's the next stage after that.
Fantastic. Well, I think the videos have been absolutely amazing. So much really interesting and insightful stuff in there. So I definitely recommend
Thank
them. I'll
you.
put a link down below as well so people
Oh,
can check
thank
it
you.
out. But Sam, it has been really, really fascinating, super interesting to chat. So thank you so much for joining me.
It's been my pleasure. Really enjoyed my time here.
Huge thanks to Sam for taking the time to chat with me about his career and just sharing so many fascinating design secrets. I had a terrific time. Thank you, Sam. If you would like to hear more from Sam, then I highly recommend checking out his YouTube channel, Sam Pearson Game Design, or SPGD. In just his first few videos, Sam is already exploring the rules and design of some modern classics from GW, like his own Warcry rules, as well as looking at older games like Inquisitor. It is genuinely fascinating stuff. Highly, highly recommended. And if you would like to support the work that I do, researching and documenting the history of Games Workshop and interviewing the people who made it great, then you can do so by checking out patreon.com/Jordan Sorcery. You'll get early access to podcasts, outtakes, research articles, a community choose your own adventure, and a lot more besides. And you can also check out my little shop on eBay under the username Jordan Sorcery, where I have actually created my own range of miniatures sculpted by Citadel legend Gary Morley, as well as some artisanal gaming supplies. Thank you once again to Sam. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.